The humid Caribbean air clung to Esperanza's skin like a silk shroud as she stood on the mahogany balcony of her family's grand estate in Port Royal, Jamaica. Below, servants scurried across the cobblestone courtyard preparing for tomorrow's wedding. Her wedding to a man she'd met only twice. The scent of jasmine and sea salt mingled with the distant aroma of rum and molasses from the docks, creating an intoxicating blend that usually brought her comfort. Tonight it felt suffocating. The estate itself was a monument to colonial prosperity, built with wealth extracted from sugar plantations that stretched inland like emerald carpets. Marble imported from Spain gleamed in the moonlight, while precious hardwoods from the mainland colonies formed elegant columns that supported terraces where her ancestors had planned their conquests of indigenous lands. Every stone, every beam, every ornate detail represented the subjugation of someone's freedom, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on Esperanza as she contemplated her own impending captivity. Esperanza, come away from there. Her mother's voice cut through the evening breeze, sharp as broken glass. Doña Isabella Montemayor emerged from the shadows of the drawing room, her emerald silk gown rustling against the polished floors. The dress alone cost more than most Port Royal families saw in a year, its intricate embroidery depicting scenes of Spanish conquest that Isabella wore with unconscious pride. It's unseemly for a bride to be seen brooding the night before her wedding. Mother, I've told you I don't love him. Esperanza's fingers tightened around the wrought iron railing until her knuckles turned white. The setting sun painted the Caribbean waters in shades of amber and gold, a freedom she'd never tasted. Ships moved across the horizon like floating dreams of escape, their sails pregnant with winds that could carry her anywhere in the world, anywhere except where she was bound to go. Don Alvaro is old enough to be my father, and his breath reeks of tobacco and decay. Isabella's laugh was cold as winter winds that never touched their tropical paradise. Love, child, you speak of fairy tales. This marriage secures our family's sugar plantations and guarantees your father's shipping routes remain protected. Don Alvaro's connections with the Spanish crown are invaluable. She moved beside her daughter, her voice softening only slightly, though the steel beneath remained unchanged. Beauty fades, mija, but security endures. Your grandmother learned this lesson when pirates raised her father's plantation in Cuba. Only through advantageous marriages did our family rebuild. The 20-year-old woman turned to face her mother, her dark eyes blazing with defiance that had been carefully suppressed for months. Those eyes held depths that Isabella had never bothered to explore, intelligence that had been dismissed as irrelevant to a woman's proper role, passion that had been channeled into acceptable pursuits like embroidery and religious devotion. And what of my happiness, my dreams? Did grandmother never long for something more than mere survival? Dreams don't pay debts or protect us from pirates, Isabella replied curtly, though something flickered across her features, perhaps the ghost of her own abandoned aspirations. Your father owes substantial sums to creditors in Havana. The hurricane last season destroyed 3 of our ships, and the slaves on the eastern plantation have grown increasingly rebellious. This union erases those obligations and elevates our social standing. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on Esperanza's shoulder with surprising gentleness. You'll learn to find contentment in duty as I did, as my mother did before me. Esperanza shrugged away from her mother's touch, her heart aching with the weight of predetermined fate. The sounds of preparation continued below, musicians tuning their instruments, their melodies drifting upward like prayers to saints who had long since stopped listening. Cooks shouted orders in rapid Spanish, their voices mixing with the clatter of pots and the sizzling of meat over open flames. The constant hammering of workers constructing a platform for tomorrow's ceremony provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaos, each nail driven into wood sounding like another bar in the cage that would soon imprison her forever. I've heard the stories, Mother. Don Alvaro has buried 2 wives already. They say he keeps them locked away in his fortress until they waste away from loneliness. Esperanza's voice trembled with barely controlled emotion. The first wife, Elena, was only 17 when she married him. They found her body at the bottom of the cliffs behind his estate, though no one dares question whether she jumped or was pushed. Is that the security you wish for me? Isabella's expression hardened like cooling metal, but Esperanza caught a brief flash of uncertainty in her mother's eyes. Gossip and speculation from jealous tongues. Don Alvaro is a respected merchant with vast holdings across the Caribbean. His previous wives died of yellow fever, a tragedy that befalls many in these climates, not cruelty. She gestured toward the bustling preparations with forced enthusiasm. Look at what he's provided for this celebration. The finest musicians from Cartagena, imported wines from Spain, enough food to feed half of Port Royal, silks from China, spices from the Orient, even a troupe of dancers from New Orleans. He honors you with this display. The irony wasn't lost on Esperanza. Tomorrow's elaborate ceremony would be her funeral, the death of everything she'd ever dreamed of becoming. She'd spent her childhood reading smuggled books about distant lands, her imagination soaring beyond the confines of colonial society. Secret sessions with her brother Miguel had taught her swordplay, archery, and navigation by the stars. She could recite poetry in 3 languages, calculate shipping routes and trade winds, and debate philosophy with the Jesuit priests who visited their estate. Yet tomorrow, all of that would be buried beneath the title of wife, as if 20 years of growth and learning were merely preparation for ornamental display in another man's. House. A commotion from the harbor caught her attention. Shouts echoed across the water, followed by the distinctive crack of musket fire. Both women turned toward the sea, where the silhouettes of several ships moved against the darkening sky. The vessels flew no recognizable flags, their black sails cutting through the waves like predatory fins. Even from this distance, Esperanza could see that these were not merchant vessels or naval ships, but something far more dangerous, lean, fast craft built for speed and stealth rather than cargo capacity. Pirates, Isabella whispered, her face draining of color. They wouldn't dare attack on such a night. The Spanish Navy. The Spanish Navy is 3 days away at minimum, Esperanza finished, remembering her father's frequent complaints about inadequate protection for merchant vessels. Captain Montemayor had petitioned the colonial governor repeatedly for increased naval patrols, only to be told that Spain's resources were stretched thin across their vast Caribbean empire. Fear and something else, a dangerous flutter of excitement stirred in her chest as she watched the dark ships approach. We should warn father. Before Isabella could respond, the sound of splintering wood and screaming voices erupted from the docks. Orange flames began to lick at the masts of merchant ships, casting dancing shadows across the harbor that turned the peaceful evening into something from Dante's Inferno. The scent of smoke mixed with gunpowder drifted toward the estate, carrying with it the chaos of battle and the promise of change. Esperanza found her pulse quickening, not with terror but with something perilously close to anticipation. Get inside now. Isabella grabbed her daughter's arm with surprising strength. We must hide until this passes. But Esperanza found herself frozen, watching as longboats filled with shadowy figures rowed toward shore with military precision. Part of her was terrified, but another part, a part she'd kept buried beneath layers of ladylike conditioning, thrilled at the sight of genuine danger. For the first time in months, she felt truly alive, her senses sharpened by adrenaline and the electric possibility that everything could change in a single night. The pirates had come to Port Royal, and tomorrow's wedding suddenly seemed like the least of her worries. Chaos erupted through Port Royal like a hurricane unleashed from the depths of hell itself. Esperanza pressed herself against the stone wall of her family's estate, watching through a crack in the shutters as pirates swarmed through the cobblestone streets below. Their war cries mixed with the screams of fleeing townspeople, creating a symphony of terror that made her heart pound against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The attackers moved with practiced efficiency rather than random violence. These were not the mindless savages that colonial propaganda portrayed, but disciplined fighters executing a coordinated assault. Some focused on the merchant ships, systematically looting cargo while setting strategic fires. Others swept through the streets targeting specific buildings, the Spanish governor's mansion, the customs house, the homes of known slave traders. The church and hospital remained untouched, suggesting these pirates followed some code of conduct that distinguished between combatants and innocents. Stay down, Isabella hissed from across the room, where she crouched behind an overturned mahogany table with several servants. Her emerald gown was now wrinkled and stained with dust, the perfect composure of colonial nobility shattered by genuine fear. They'll pass us by if we remain silent. But silence seemed impossible as boots thundered across the courtyard outside. The wedding preparations, those beautiful decorations that had symbolized her impending imprisonment, now lay scattered and burning. Silk ribbons from Lion and Tropical, flowers from the estate's gardens were trampled underfoot by men and women who recognized no law but their own. The elaborate platform where she was to have been married burned like a funeral pyre, its imported wood crackling with flames that seemed to mock the pretensions of colonial society. The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire house, sending splinters of precious mahogany flying across the marble floor. Through the splintered wood stepped a figure that seemed carved from the very essence of the Caribbean night. Tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of years under tropical skies, the pirate captain surveyed the room with eyes the color of stormy seas. His black hair was tied back with a leather cord decorated with small silver coins, trophies from previous conquests. A cutlass hung at his side, its blade catching the firelight that flickered through broken windows, while a brace of pistols crossed his broad chest like instruments of deadly poetry. "Ladies," he said with a voice like aged rum, smooth but burning, carrying the musical cadence of someone who had learned Spanish in the islands rather than the courts of Europe. His accent held traces of Portuguese mixed with something else, perhaps the Creole patois of escaped slaves who had found freedom among the Brotherhood of the Sea. "Captain Diego Mendoza at your service." He executed a mocking bow that somehow managed to be both elegant and threatening, his movements fluid as water yet precise as a master swordsman's. Isabella rose slowly, her aristocratic training taking control despite the terror that made her hands tremble like autumn leaves. "Captain, we have nothing of value here. The family strongbox was moved to the church for safekeeping, and most of our jewelry is locked away in the town's vault." Her voice carried the desperate hope of someone grasping at straws, though she maintained the imperious tone that had commanded servants and intimidated social inferiors for decades. Mendoza's smile revealed teeth as white as Caribbean sand. "Ah, but you underestimate what I consider valuable, Doña Isabella." His gaze swept the room, taking in the imported furniture, the oil paintings of Spanish nobility, the religious artifacts that proclaimed the family's devotion to crown and cross. But when his eyes settled on Esperanza, who remained frozen by the window, they held a different quality, not the predatory hunger she might have expected, but something closer to recognition. "I seek something far more precious than gold or silver. My daughter is to be married tomorrow," Isabella said quickly, stepping protectively in front of Esperanza with the fierce instinct of a mother defending her young. "She's promised to Don Alvaro de Castilla, a man of great influence with the Spanish crown. Surely even pirates respect the sanctity of Don Alvaro?" Mendoza's laughter cut through the air like a blade through silk. "That bloated Spanish pig who believes he owns half the Caribbean? The same man who branded my cousin like cattle before throwing him overboard to drown in chains?" His expression darkened with memories of old grievances. "I've been hunting his ships for months, watching his trade routes, learning his weaknesses. He's cost me 3 ships and 15 good men with his naval escorts and hired assassins." His eyes narrowed as he studied Esperanza more carefully, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she held herself despite her fear. "So you're his intended bride. How fortuitous." Esperanza finally found her voice, though it came out stronger than she'd expected. The months of suppressed rebellion suddenly crystallized into defiant courage. "I am Esperanza Montemayor, and I fear no pirate." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but something about the captain's presence made her want to stand tall rather than cower like the helpless maiden she'd been raised to become. "Esperanza," he repeated, rolling her name around his tongue like fine wine, savoring each syllable. Hope, how perfectly fitting for someone trapped in a cage of golden silk. He took a step closer and she caught the scent of sea spray and leather, adventure and danger, the intoxicating aroma of a man who lived by his own rules. "Tell me, señorita, do you go willingly to this marriage? Do you love the man who bought you like a prize mare at auction?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the burning ships outside, heavy with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Isabella's sharp intake of breath warned Esperanza to choose her words carefully, but for once in her life, she decided to speak truth rather than diplomacy. The chaos surrounding them had stripped away the pretense of civilized society, creating a moment of raw honesty that demanded nothing less than complete authenticity. "No," she whispered, then louder, with growing conviction. "No, I do not. I despise him and everything he represents." Mendoza nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then perhaps fate has smiled upon us both tonight." He gestured to two of his crew members who had appeared in the doorway. A weathered woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms that told stories of distant lands and hard-won victories, and a young man barely older than Esperanza herself, whose eyes held the wisdom of someone who had faced death and found it less frightening than slavery. "Maria, Tomas, escort the ladies to their rooms, gently," he added with emphasis that carried the weight of absolute authority. "We are not barbarians, despite what Spanish propaganda might claim." "Captain, please," Isabella pleaded, dropping to her knees with the desperation of someone watching her carefully constructed world crumble. "Take our gold, our silver, whatever you wish. Take our ships, our plantation deeds, even the slaves if you must. But leave my daughter. She's all I have left." "Your daughter," Mendoza interrupted, his voice gentling slightly as he recognized genuine maternal anguish, "is exactly what I wish. But not for the reasons you fear." He turned back to Esperanza, studying her with an intensity that made her skin flush despite the danger. "Don Alvaro has cost me more than ships and men. He's taken friends, family members, people I've sworn to protect. Taking his bride seems appropriate compensation. But more than that." He paused, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers with startling directness. "I suspect the lady herself might prefer the honesty of pirates to the lies of Spanish nobility." The reality of the situation crashed over Esperanza like a rogue wave. She was about to be kidnapped by pirates, a fate that should have terrified any respectable colonial woman into immediate submission. Instead, as she looked into Diego Mendoza's storm-gray eyes, she felt something she'd never experienced in Don Alvaro's presence. A dangerous thrill that made her pulse quicken with possibility rather than dread. "And if I refuse to go?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness and the steady tone of her voice. Mendoza's smile widened, revealing not cruelty, but something that might have been admiration. "Then I suppose we'll have to convince you that the sea offers better company than Spanish nobility." He extended his hand toward her, calloused palm facing up in a gesture that somehow managed to be both invitation and challenge. "The choice, Señorita Hope, is yours to make freely." Behind him, the sounds of the raid continued, but they seemed more organized now, less chaotic than the random violence she'd expected. Through the window, she could see crew members helping injured townspeople, carefully avoiding the church where families had taken sanctuary, even sharing water with frightened children. Whatever else they were, these pirates followed some code of honor that distinguished them from the mindless savages of colonial nightmares. Isabella's voice cracked with desperation. "Esperanza, don't listen to him. Think of your reputation, your future, your place in society." "What future, Mother?" Esperanza's words came out sharper than she'd intended, 20 years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "Tomorrow I become property passed from your hands to Don Alvaro's like a piece of furniture or livestock. At least pirates are honest about their intentions and don't dress slavery in the language of love and duty." The captain's eyes sparked with something that might have been admiration. "Spoken like a true daughter of the Caribbean, the sea calls to those with courage in their hearts and rebellion in their souls." For 20 years, Esperanza had obeyed every rule, followed every expectation, prepared for a life of genteel servitude disguised as feminine virtue. Now, with flames dancing outside and freedom wearing the face of a pirate captain, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her existence. The woman she had been trained to become would choose safety, security, the approval of society. But that woman was dying in the flames outside, and someone new was being born from the ashes. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the distance, probably the Spanish garrison, finally responding to the attack with their typical inefficiency. Time was running short, and with it, the moment of choice that might never come again. Mendoza's hand remained extended, patient but urgent. Choose quickly, señorita. The tide waits for no one, and dawn will bring pursuit. Esperanza looked at her mother's tear-stained face, at the servants cowering in the corners, at the life of predetermined duty that awaited her return to normal order. Then she looked at the captain's outstretched hand, scarred, weathered by salt and sun, but offering something she'd never had, the power to choose her own fate. With a deep breath that tasted of smoke and possibility, Esperanza stepped forward and placed her hand in his. The pirate ship Libertad cut through Caribbean waters like a blade through silk, its black sails pregnant with trade winds that carried them away from Jamaica and toward an uncertain horizon. Esperanza stood at the stern, watching Port Royal shrink to a smudge of smoke on the distant coastline. The wedding dress her mother had commissioned, yards of imported French lace and Spanish silk worth more than most families earned in a lifetime, lay abandoned in her cabin, replaced by practical cotton breeches and a linen shirt borrowed from the ship's quartermaster. The transformation felt symbolic as much as practical. Gone were the restrictive corsets that had molded her body into an acceptable feminine shape, the delicate slippers that prevented any but the most ladylike steps, the elaborate undergarments that served no purpose but to slow down any activity more vigorous than needlework. In their place, clothing designed for movement, for work, for a life lived rather than merely displayed. Her hair, usually tortured into elaborate styles that took hours to achieve, now hung in a simple braid down her back, practical and comfortable. Regrets already? Diego Mendoza appeared beside her, his approach silent as a cat's despite the creaking deck beneath their feet. In daylight she could see him more clearly, the network of small scars that spoke of countless battles, the premature lines around his eyes from squinting against sun and spray, the careful way he held himself that suggested old wounds never quite forgotten. Not regrets, Esperanza replied, surprised by her own honesty. The fresh sea air filled her lungs with a clean sweetness that made the perfumed atmosphere of colonial society seem artificial by comparison. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terrified. She turned to face him, noting how the sea breeze had loosened his dark hair from its leather binding.
What happens to me now?
Am I prisoner or guest? Diego's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her question, leaning against the ship's rail with the easy balance of someone who had spent years learning the sea's moods. That depends entirely on you, señorita. You chose to come aboard of your own will. That makes you neither prisoner nor guest, but something new entirely. He gestured toward the busy crew members adjusting rigging and checking supplies with the practiced efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Welcome to the only true democracy in the Caribbean. The next weeks passed in a blur of discovery that challenged everything Esperanza had believed about pirates, society, and herself. The crew of the Libertad operated under articles that governed their conduct, rules democratically agreed upon and fairly enforced by people who had chosen to live outside conventional society but not outside all moral structure. These weren't the lawless savages of Spanish propaganda, but men and women who had created their own civilization based on merit rather than birth, choice rather than circumstance. Maria Fernandez, the tattooed woman who served as quartermaster, explained their code while teaching Esperanza to tie proper sailor's knots. Her hands bore the calluses of honest labor, and her stories revealed a past as a escaped slave who had earned her freedom through courage and skill rather than birth or purchase. Every decision affecting the crew gets voted on, Maria said, her scarred hands working rope with practiced efficiency. Captain Diego leads in battle and navigation because we trust his judgment, but the rest of the time we're equals. Even former Spanish noblewomen can earn their place here, if they're willing to work for it. The ship's doctor, an elderly former priest named Padre Santos, taught her basic medical skills while sharing stories of how he joined the crew after being excommunicated for treating indigenous peoples as equals worthy of God's love. His gentle hands could set bones or deliver sermons with equal skill, and his library of stolen books became Esperanza's refuge during quiet evening hours. Freedom, he explained while showing her how to clean wounds and mix herbal remedies, isn't just about escaping chains. It's about choosing who you become when no one else's expectations define you. But it was Diego himself who proved the most challenging teacher. Unlike Don Alvaro, who had viewed her as a pretty ornament to display at social functions, the pirate captain treated her as an intelligent equal, capable of growth and contribution. He taught her swordplay on the deck during calm evenings, his patient corrections helping her transform childhood games with Miguel into deadly skills that could save her life. "Your stance is too rigid," he observed during one session, circling her as she practiced thrust and parry combinations against an imaginary opponent. "Fighting isn't about perfect form, it's about adaptability. The sea teaches us to bend rather than break, to find balance in constant motion." His own movements flowed like water, each step and gesture economical yet graceful. Their blades met with a ring of steel, and Esperanza found herself inches from his face, close enough to see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow and catch the scent of sea salt on his skin. The intensity in his gray eyes made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with swordplay, a heat that spread through her body like Caribbean sunshine. "Like this?" she whispered, adjusting her grip and stance according to his instructions. "Exactly like that," he replied, his voice rougher than usual, thick with something that had nothing to do with sword instruction. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The setting sun painted them both in shades of gold and amber, while the gentle rocking of the ship seemed to draw them closer with each heartbeat. Then young Tomas called from the crow's nest about a sail on the horizon, and the spell broke as Diego stepped back. Professional distance restored, but not before she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his expression. But that night, as Esperanza lay in her small cabin listening to the crew's songs and stories drifting through the thin walls, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes. For the first time in her life, a man saw her as more than a potential wife or mother. He saw her as a person capable of strength, growth, and choice. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying. The songs themselves told stories of freedom won through courage, of lives reclaimed from those who would have owned them. Former slaves sang alongside escaped debtors, reformed prostitutes harmonized with disgraced soldiers, and all found acceptance among people who understood that society's outcasts often possessed the clearest vision of its flaws. The Libertad made port in Tortuga 3 weeks later, and Esperanza got her first taste of true pirate society. The island buzzed with activity as ships of various flags traded goods, information, and crew members in a carnival atmosphere that mixed danger with celebration. Women fought alongside men in tavern brawls, their skill with blade and pistol earning respect rather than condemnation. Former slaves captained their own vessels with crews that included their former masters' sons, social hierarchy completely inverted from the world she'd known. "It's not perfect," Diego admitted as they walked through the chaotic port town, past taverns where ex-priests shared drinks with reformed murderers and former countesses bargained with one-eyed smugglers. "We have our own problems: jealousy, greed, the constant threat of naval patrols. Personal vendettas sometimes spiral out of control, and not everyone who claims to seek freedom truly understands what it means." His hand rested lightly on his sword hilt, a reminder that violence was never far away in this lawless paradise. But here, at least, a person's worth isn't determined by their birth or gender. What you do matters more than who your father was. Esperanza watched a female captain negotiating the sale of captured Spanish silver, her authority unquestioned by the rough men surrounding her negotiating table. The woman's scarred face and missing left hand spoke of battles fought and survived, while her elegant clothes and educated accent suggested aristocratic origins abandoned for a more authentic life. In Port Royal, I would have been scandalized by such a sight. Now, she trailed off, trying to find words for the strange liberation she felt. "Now?" Diego prompted, his eyes studying her face with the attention of someone truly interested in her thoughts, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Now I wonder why I ever thought there was only one way to live, why I accepted that my entire existence should be defined by other people's needs and expectations." Their eyes met across the crowded market square, and this time neither looked away. The attraction that had been building during their weeks at sea finally acknowledged itself, electric as a tropical storm gathering on the horizon. But before either could speak, a commotion erupted near the harbor that shattered the moment like glass. "Spanish warships," someone shouted from the docks. "3 galleons flying the colors of Castilla." Diego's expression hardened instantly, the lover replaced by the calculating pirate captain who had survived years in these dangerous waters. "Don Alvaro's fleet. He's come hunting for his stolen bride." He grabbed Esperanza's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers with desperate urgency. We need to leave now. As they ran toward the Libertad, dodging through crowds of panicking pirates and merchants, Esperanza felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The safe world she'd known was hunting her, trying to drag her back to a life of gilded captivity. But beside her ran a man who offered something infinitely more precious than security: the chance to discover who she truly was when all the rules were stripped away. The race was on, and for the first time in her life, Esperanza was running toward something instead of away from it. The chase lasted 3 days across the azure expanse of the Caribbean, with Don Alvaro's warships pursuing the Libertad like hunting hounds on a bloody scent. Esperanza stood watch alongside the crew, her hands steady on the rigging despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins like liquid fire. The woman who had once fainted at the sight of blood now helped tend wounds from the intermittent cannon fire, her transformation complete yet still, evolving with each crisis that tested her newfound strength. The Spanish ships were magnificent and terrible, floating fortresses bristling with cannon and packed with soldiers trained to show no mercy to pirates. Their sails bore the arms of Castilla, symbols of an empire that considered these waters its private lake. Don Alvaro's flagship, the San Cristobal, was a galleon of legendary reputation, its 60 guns capable of reducing the Libertad to splinters in a single broadside. "They're gaining," Maria called from the crow's nest, her spyglass trained on the pursuing Spanish galleons that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. "The lead ship will be in firing range within the hour. Captain, we need to make a decision." Diego studied their options with the calculating mind that had kept him alive in these dangerous waters for more years than most pirates survived. The Libertad was faster than the Spanish ships, built for speed rather than firepower, but they were running low on fresh water and couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely. More importantly, his crew was exhausted, and several had been wounded in their hasty escape from Tortuga when Don Alvaro's fleet appeared on the horizon like harbingers of doom. "Captain," Tomas approached hesitantly, his young face grave with the weight of difficult words. Behind him, several crew members watched with expressions that mixed loyalty with pragmatic concern for their own survival. "Some of the men are talking. They say maybe we should negotiate, return the señorita and avoid a battle we can't win." The suggestion hung in the air like storm clouds, heavy with unspoken implications. Esperanza felt every eye on the deck turned toward her, measuring her worth against their collective survival. It was a reasonable proposal. One person's freedom weighed against the lives of 30 seasoned pirates who had families, dreams, and ambitions of their own. In the world she'd left behind, the calculation would have been simple. A woman's desires meant nothing compared to men's lives. But Diego's response surprised no one who truly knew him, though it confirmed everything Esperanza had begun to suspect about his character. "Any man who wants to surrender can take a boat and row back to Don Alvaro himself," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the deck without need for shouting. "But the Libertad doesn't trade in human cargo, willing or unwilling. Even if it means our deaths?" pressed one of the older crew members, a grizzled sailor named Renzo, whose scarred face spoke of decades surviving Caribbean dangers. "Captain, we respect your principles, but dead martyrs can't protect anyone." Diego's gray eyes found Esperanza's across the crowded deck. In them she saw not just desire or protection, but something deeper: respect for her right to choose her own fate even if that choice doomed them all. It was the look of a man who understood that some things were worth dying for, and freedom topped that list. "Especially then," he answered with quiet conviction. The Spanish ships opened fire at sunset, their cannonballs splashing into the sea just short of the Libertad's stern. The message was clear: surrender or be destroyed. But as night fell and stars began to pierce the tropical sky, Diego revealed why he'd earned his reputation as the most cunning captain in the Caribbean. "There's a passage through the coral reefs ahead," he explained to his assembled crew, pointing toward what appeared to be empty ocean, but which his experienced eyes could read like a map. "Narrow as a needle's eye and twice as sharp. The Spanish ships draw too much water to follow, but we can make it through if we're willing to risk everything." "And if we miscalculate?" Maria asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was asking more for the crew's benefit than her own. "Then we join the dozens of ships already sleeping on those reefs," Diego admitted with brutal honesty. but we'll do it as free people, not slaves dragged back to lives we never chose. The crew voted unanimously to attempt the passage. Even those who had suggested surrender voted for the desperate gamble, understanding that freedom meant nothing if it could be surrendered at the first sign of danger. What followed was the most harrowing night of Esperanza's life. Guided only by starlight and Diego's intimate knowledge of these treacherous waters, the Libertad threaded between razor-sharp coral formations that could tear open her hull like paper. Every sailor aboard held their breath as the ship scraped past obstacles that remained invisible in the darkness, trusting their captain's memory and skill completely. The ocean here was a maze of death disguised as beauty. Coral reefs that appeared as dark shadows beneath the surface could gut a ship in seconds, while sudden shallows could ground them helplessly within cannon range of their pursuers. The sound of waves breaking over hidden obstacles provided the only warning of danger, and more than once the ship shuddered as its keel scraped coral that came within inches of ending their flight. Esperanza found herself standing beside Diego at the wheel, close enough to feel the tension in his muscles as he fought to keep them on course. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air, and she could see the enormous strain of navigating by instinct and memory through waters that had claimed countless lives. "Why?" she whispered during a momentary lull when the immediate danger seemed to ease slightly. "Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" He glanced at her, moonlight catching the intensity in his storm-colored eyes. For a moment, the mask of the confident captain slipped, revealing something vulnerable and achingly human beneath. "Because the moment I saw you refuse that arranged marriage, I recognized something in you that I've spent my entire life searching for." "What?" "The courage to choose freedom over safety, even when the cost might be everything." His voice was soft but carried clearly over the sound of waves and wind. "Most people talk about freedom, but when the moment comes to choose, they pick security. You didn't. You chose the unknown over the familiar, danger over comfort. That kind of courage is rarer than any treasure." Their hands touched on the ship's wheel, and Esperanza felt a connection deeper than passion or desire, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both chosen the dangerous path of authentic living over the comfortable cage of social expectation. It was love, she realized with startling clarity, but not the desperate neediness she'd been taught to expect. This was love between equals, between two people who chose each other freely rather than being bound by duty or circumstance. Behind them, the Spanish galleons had given up the chase, unwilling to risk their valuable ships in the deadly coral maze. Don Alvaro's pursuit was over for now, but Esperanza knew her former betrothed well enough to realize this was only a temporary reprieve. He would never forgive the insult to his pride, and pirates, even successful ones, lived constantly on borrowed time. Dawn broke over calm seas as the Libertad emerged safely from the reef passage, her hull scarred but intact. The crew celebrated their escape with songs and shared rum, their voices carrying across the water like prayers of thanksgiving. But Esperanza found herself contemplating the future with new eyes, understanding that she was no longer the sheltered colonial daughter who had fled an unwanted marriage, nor was she simply a pirate's rescued captive. Somewhere between Port Royal and this moment, she had become someone entirely new, a woman who had chosen her path freely and was prepared to defend that choice with her life if necessary. "So what happens now?" she asked Diego as they stood together watching the sunrise paint the Caribbean in shades of gold and amber. The question held layers of meaning. What happens to us, to the crew, to this life we've chosen together? "Now," he said, taking her hand in his weathered one with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his reputation as a feared pirate captain, "you decide who you want to become. The sea has given you freedom. What you do with it is your choice." Esperanza looked out at the endless ocean that stretched to every horizon, no longer a barrier to her dreams but a pathway to infinite possibility. She thought of her mother's words about security and duty, of Don Alvaro's plans to cage her in his fortress like a prize bird, of the life of predetermined subservience she had escaped. All of that seemed like someone else's story now, events that had happened to a different woman in a different world. Then she looked at Diego, not as a rescuer or replacement husband, but as a partner who saw her as an equal. The attraction between them was undeniable, but more important was the respect, the shared values, the mutual recognition of each other's strength and independence. Here was a man who would fight for her freedom rather than trying to control it. "I choose the sea," she said finally, her voice steady with newfound conviction that came from deep within her soul. "I choose adventure over security, truth over comfort, and love that sets me free rather than binds me to someone else's vision of who I should be." Diego's smile was radiant as the Caribbean dawn, transforming his weathered features into something beautiful and wild. "Then welcome home, Esperanza Montemayor. Welcome to your real life." As the Libertad sailed toward the horizon, her black sails proud against the morning sky like flags of victory, Esperanza felt the last chains of her old existence fall away. She was no longer a daughter, a potential bride, or a captive. She was herself, fully and completely for the first time in her 20 years of life. The woman who had been suffocating in colonial respectability was dead, and in her place stood someone stronger, freer, more authentic than she had ever dared to imagine. The Caribbean stretched endlessly ahead, filled with dangers and wonders, challenges and choices she couldn't yet imagine, but whatever came next, she would face it as the woman she had chosen to become. Free, strong, and finally truly alive. Behind them, the smoke of Port Royal had long since disappeared beneath the curve of the earth, taking with it all the expectations and limitations that had once defined her world. Ahead lay every possibility she had ever dared to dream, and many she had never thought to imagine, waiting to be claimed by a woman brave enough to reach for them.